Welcome to the Magento Pulse on Talk Commerce. I'm your host, Brent Peterson. In this special series of episodes, we bring you stories of the people from the Magento community, as well as the fantastic Magento events like Meet Magento New York, happening October 10th, 2024. For more information, go to meetmagentonyc.com. Today's episode is proudly sponsored by Content in Commerce from contentbasis.io. Discover how your content can build free traffic for your e-commerce store by visiting contentbasis.io. Stay tuned as we dive into the latest in the world of Magento. For more information about Meet Magentos, click on the QR code in the video or go to tlk.fm/mm24nyc. Thank you.
You're listening to Talk Commerce. Subscribe and download at talk-commerce.com.
Welcome to this special community edition of Talk Commerce. Today I have Jisse Ritsma calling in fresh from the Netherlands. Jisse, please do an introduction for yourself. Tell us your day-to-day role. Yurio is your company. Tell us one of your passions in life.
So you told me that the first thing that we're going to do is that you tell a joke.
No, that comes after your introduction. Okay. No, this is not the joke yet.
Sorry. Thank you, Brent. Yeah, so my name is Jisse Ritsma from the Netherlands, and I own a little company, Yurio. And for some time, I've been developing extensions also with Yurio, but I have to admit that it's a little bit on a lower pace. But I started to do trainings already way back in... with Magento 1 even. And then I started to do the same thing with Magento 2, and I'm still doing that thanks to Hyvä and MageOS and all of the fresh involvements. But yeah, doing my thing.
Good. And you are going to tell us a passion that you have in life?
Well, in preparation of this, we talked about my family, and I have to admit that I became dad 2.5 months ago of a fresh-born son called Abel. So that's the biblical name. I'm not sure how you pronounce that in English. Abel, yeah. So, and we're not that biblical, but it's just a beautiful name on its own. And since then, family's back on the agenda. And I really love my daughter Sophie and son Abel, and of course my wife Susan. Who's not your Susan, by the way.
Yeah, but, I have my own Susan.
Yeah, everybody needs a Susan.
Everybody needs a Susan. There you go. Abel and Abel. I like Abel sounds better. Yeah. And tell me your daughter's name again. I'm sorry.
Sophie.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's great. And that is a very good passion and very well said. Thank you. All right. So before we do get started, and I would like to talk a little bit about the Magento community and MageOS, and I've had a realization or come to whatever.
Epiphany.
Yes. Yeah. Good. But let me do the joke and we'll get that out of the way and then we'll start talking. Here we go. So all you have to do is react to the joke, because I know that you put on this great conference called Reacticon, and I haven't been to the conference, but I thought the conference was all about you just doing different hand gestures and see how people react to them. Right? Is that correct?
This is not the joke.
No. I'm trying to get an idea of what your conference is about.
Okay.
No, it's not.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So the conference is only about how people react to different hand gestures that you do, because you were doing this earlier.
Yeah, and then actually the conference is really about seeing the reaction on their faces.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Okay, so I got it right. Here we go. So I'm going to tell you the joke. Here we go. My kids put together a PowerPoint presentation explaining why we should go to the water park. It had several slides.
Nice. Okay, well.
Anything?
Well, nice joke.
Nothing?
Is my sound off? Or did you?
No, I hear you.
Okay. Yeah. No, I like the joke. Thank you.
I replaced my rooster with a duck. Now I wake up at the quack of dawn.
Okay.
Is that any better? Should we stop?
No, yeah, please.
Please stop.
No, please stop. Yeah, no, but I love these little jokes. But I have to admit that well, no, I don't know those jokes anymore that I didn't get. But in the past, you told me a couple of times those jokes that really require you to know the proper English words and all of their double meaning or whatever. And then it's getting a little bit harder. But I get the quacks and the slides and no.
Because I know you, I'll tell you one more. And I tripped over my wife's bra. It was a booby trap.
Okay. Nice. The stupid thing is, if I want to translate this to Dutch, I can't. It's just
yeah. Well, maybe I'll try.
No.
I'll use AI to do that. All right. So I do. So in our green room, we kind of prepped it with the state of the Magento community. I've been very prolific, if I could say. There hasn't been a lot of people writing about the Magento community. There hasn't been a lot of anything happening except for Meet Magentos.
Yeah.
And I think one thing is that, but I will say that there has been a resurgence of the Magento community, especially in Europe, around the Hyvä theme that has brought a lot of energy back into things. And I think one thing that I've experienced is a different outlook of how it feels here in the U.S. compared to how I'm sure it feels in Europe. So I wanted to get your kind of take on that. And then the second part of what I would like to speak to later on is MageOS and how that is going to help energize Magento open source. But I do want to get your perspective on the Magento community and how you feel it is right now.
Yeah. Well, I personally have to admit that in my personal life, a couple of things happened. I became dad, and now of a second. And before that, COVID happened. And since COVID, we actually didn't meet in person anymore. So I think the last time that we met in person was in Austin at Mage Titans Austin's that you organized. And I think that's actually maybe the same for some more people. Definitely also when the Adobe takeover kicked in. So still a couple of Dutchies they went over to the US to attend Adobe Summit and etc. But I think a large portion just said, well, let's focus maybe on Europe first to see what happens now in Europe. And besides that, a lot of people just stopped traveling altogether. So yeah, I think since COVID, but also since the merger basically just came up more and more. The ecosystem might have been split a little bit between Europe and the US again.
Yeah, again. I think,
but that's kind of like normal. I think that we're not yet in a world where everything is just totally global, and traveling across the ocean is hard, and etc. So it's basically explaining why there could be differences. But I think you're more focused upon, of course, what those differences are exactly. Well, and I think one thing that is really, really different between Europe and the US is that whenever Adobe comes up with their own strategy and they say commerce is the best and etc., then in the US there's still a lot of potential, a lot of clients out there that are large enough to actually go along with that story as well. However, then if you compare things with, for instance, the Netherlands, then in the Netherlands there's just far too few web shops that are capable of paying the licenses of the Adobe Experience Cloud and therefore Adobe Commerce itself as well. And therefore, I think the percentage for some reason in the Netherlands, definitely for Magento open source is much larger than that percentage that Adobe Commerce takes in. And adding to that, the Adobe story also needs to try and to travel across that ocean in the other way. Just that the Dutchies went to Adobe Summit. The message of Adobe is not European, is not our message. So immediately we label that, well, that's the large company that is almost at the other point of the world, and should we believe that or not? Well, and I think actually progressively, when the merger happened and when the Magento open source roadmap stalled and other claims were made, let me just put this polite, that belief of separation just became larger. And well, at that moment, everyone needed to choose, are we going to go the Adobe way or are we going to go a different way? And I think we were also going to mention the word or the name shopware, because that's also one thing that happened. A lot of Magento agencies in Europe also switched to shopware as an alternative because they couldn't go along with the Adobe Commerce story, at least for their own clients. So I think that happened definitely also. That's maybe explaining also part of the difference between what is happening in the US and what happened in Europe. That with in the US, it's kind of like logical maybe to follow along with a huge brand name like Adobe, because it's also how the US becomes larger. Like the US is making everything a big iconic thing, and therefore to follow an icon like Adobe kind of like makes sense. And if you can't follow along, then you can always go to Shopify, which is Shopify also a US brand, by the way?
I think it's
so.
Canadian.
Oh yeah. But in Europe, we're more skeptical towards those US brands, saying like, oh, but this is the new way of doing it with it, and that skepticism also led, I think, actually to the current split in the ecosystem on itself. And I'm not saying that Europe is responsible for the whole split. It's more that it's explaining maybe the different attitude in things.
Well, yeah, I want to dig into what you said a little earlier about the Adobe's message is not the European message, and I think that we all recognize that Adobe has gone upstream with the messaging around Magento, around Adobe Commerce, and that there is no messaging anymore for medium-sized businesses. It's all about enterprise businesses.
No, yeah, and that's it for the practical part, of course. Like if you need to pick a Magento-like product for a customer that is not able to afford the license of Adobe Commerce, then well, you need to choose Magento open source. And if there's no roadmap for Magento open source anymore, then what? No, but I think it's more also that what I was referring to is more that at Adobe Summit, a lot of the announcements for Adobe Commerce were made with a lot of cheering and a lot of applause, and always those applauses and those cheerings. It's more an American thing to actually cheer along with everything as well, while the Europeans are just sitting on their chair looking like, well, I don't trust this. And that difference in attitude is maybe also explaining why people in the Netherlands or people in Europe didn't want to just sit down and wait until Adobe came with something different, but they just said, well, if Adobe is not doing the thing that we want Adobe to do, then theoretically we need to do it ourselves. And that's, I think, how the MageOS movement was born in the first place. And we didn't really mention MageOS yet, but now we need to do that, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that when that letter came out a couple of years ago, I was sort of opposed to it, and I thought that this was not a good thing for the community.
No,
but
no.
I will say now that I've taken 180 degree review on this, and I feel it's the only thing that we need now, especially what you said. We've heard Adobe say it over and over again that they're committed to Magento. However, we've also seen now that there's no more features ever going to be put into Magento. There's no version of Magento coming out. So Magento has turned into really just this plugin to Experience Manager. that is slowly getting eaten up by SaaS microservices. Or, I mean, now that I saw there's Adobe Catalog, right, which can replace your Magento catalog. So there's going to be little pieces that I feel that are going to start picking away at what Magento is. And of course, none of us know what the actual roadmap is that is the underpinning of whatever Adobe Commerce is. But I don't feel, I feel like Magento was a bridge to keep Adobe in the game. And it's going to keep them in the game until their new product comes out, which will be some kind of a SaaS product that replaces Magento.
Yeah, and the difficulty was at the moment when actually Adobe came out with that news, or Magento came out with that news that the two merged. There were always two reasons. One was Adobe simply needed to have a commerce product to add to their Experience Cloud. Well, that's still totally true as well. So that's where we see the roadmap evolving and all of the additional products being added and etc. But the second part was that they also chose Magento for its community. And that's still kind of like the tricky part, because if you buy a community, then first of all, a lot of people are opposed to that as well, because you can't buy a community. You can only buy the people that are actually buying licenses, but everyone who's contributing, or just the freeloaders that are just using everything for free, you can't just earn money from it. So there always has been an expectation, sooner or later we're going to see how Adobe is going to profit from that community somehow. And I always thought, okay, but that's going to be what is it called? The Adobe stock integration, so that people are just simply going into their Magento admin and buy all of the stock images there, and suddenly they're making huge money out of that. Well, I'm not saying that it's going to be huge, but at least some income. I'm not sure if that's paying off any revenue at this moment, but I don't think it's a large percentage. Or integrating Illustrator or Photoshop into the Magento admin panel, or weird stuff like that. But there has been little movement there. The only movement was basically on the commerce part, on the integration with the Experience Cloud. So I think that second reason is still doubtful whether it's actually true.
Yeah, we still have Adobe. I mean, the one thing they launched is Adobe Payments. That is a plugin, and you can use it in open source. I think the one thing the community has complained a lot about is the fact that a lot of these things that they've produced are only for Adobe Commerce. Like Sensei would be a great example of intelligent artificial intelligence or machine learning that could be bolted into Magento. And what a great way to get a Magento open source person to pay for an Adobe license than allow them to use Adobe Sensei and have licensing costs involved, or even on-demand costs, just like ChatGPT does now. So I think you're right. There's a lot of missed opportunities, and I disagree that Adobe's in it for the community anymore. I don't think that they see the community as an asset at all. I think they see it as sort of an annoying little bug that keeps buzzing around their head, and every once in a while they have to kind of swat it away.
Well, there's still this other potential as well, and that's basically just the open source part. That if Adobe Commerce itself is is currently just add-on features on top of Magento open source, plus of course the rest of the Experience Cloud added to that. And that addition is actually the largest part of all. But there's B2B modules, there's all of these add-on modules. And as long as those modules are there and the commerce customers are needing for it, then actually there needs to be a core that also facilitates those modules as well. Because without the core, then those modules could not exist anymore. And as long as that's there, and as long as those modules and those customers that are paying for those modules are earning revenue for Adobe, then they need to have that core vital as well. So in that reasoning, I personally think that they do want the community to pick up upon the development of that core altogether. But that's where the confusion actually starts. So if they really wanted to make sure that the community is responsible for the core, then they should have given that community much more autonomy, or
Yeah, like
I
give
don't
them
know,
a little bit more just to say in what
self-governance, or
happens. Yeah.
yeah. So and that's where actually a couple of the attempts with the Magento Association ended up in a failure. So there was too much talk, but not letting go. And sometimes you need to let go to let something else grow that is not in your own hands, but in somebody else's hands. So if you keep parenting, so that's something I need to learn on a personal level sooner or later. If you're doing too much parenting, then actually that freedom never evolves into something more beautiful. And that's I think where we need to ask ourselves whether Adobe is actually experienced in open source at all. So they did have always a couple of open source projects, but I personally believe that this is the first endeavor where they really try to make sure that the community is actually responsible for maintaining, instead of just a couple of engineers. But that experiment so far is not going too well.
Yeah.
However, but that brings us maybe towards MageOS, and that started off with a letter and then a bigger project. And I talked recently also with Vinay Kopp in preparation of another presentation, and then I asked him, like, could you explain a little bit what the current position would be of MageOS versus Adobe versus the Magento Association, and he explained that it's currently poking the bear. So there's this huge giant, and MageOS has a little stick that picking at the bear or poking at the bear and trying at I don't know, like at the belly and seeing like, hey, does this hurt? And then let's try to propose a license change. And does it hurt there? And slowly they're trying to find out what the real expectations are, but also the real plans are of Adobe, because currently there's not enough transparency to simply tell from whatever Adobe's telling. So there's a lot of confusion still, and I think actually that MageOS, the further they drive up the conflict, is that an expression?
Yeah, I mean, I think I started out by saying I've had this new realization, this epiphany that MageOS now is very important, and I think what's going to happen is that MageOS needs to have a version that has a new feature in it and people can use. And just like Shopware has come out with all these AI features, and they came out with them very quickly.
Yeah.
They were in their core right away. And even in their open source version had some AI features in it that Magento has to do, or MageOS has to do the same. Because I think that the biggest thing that now people are going to miss out on in Adobe Commerce is the fact that there is no built-in AI in anything, and they're going to get slowly left behind, and without any vision from leadership. They're leaving it up to the community there's extensions on the marketplace, but nobody, I think I think the perception of marketplace with vendors is that it is something more towards the community and less towards enterprise.
Definitely.
So,
and maybe to bring back before we dive into maybe other specific things of MageOS and Hyvä, of course, as well. We started talking about the difference between Europe and the US, and that's maybe also where that letter that was written by MageOS, or back then it was not called MageOS, but I don't know what this was called anymore, but it had a different name, Mosca or something, or I
can't remember the name right now.
But what struck me, and I found it cool at that moment as well, was that maybe 20 people signed that listing or that letter. And of those 20, I could count 4 of those people as my personal friends. and some other people that I closely work together with, and all of them were buddies. But that's already actually an issue on its own, that there's a group of people that is so tight that they can trust each other. But if you're looking at from a distance, then you can see all of those people work together. Even worse, I believe that in that listing of 20 people, there were only three of them outside of Europe.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's totally true, but I got that impression. And from that moment onwards, then you have that separation between Adobe, a huge giant in the US, and that sees a letter from a group of people that always wear T-shirts and etc. And are not founders of large enterprise companies, and they write a letter. Come on. And of course, therefore, the logical step was to actually bring it up to the moment that we are at this very moment, that MageOS is actually delivering something for real, because that's the only way to prove that actually whatever the people were threatening with, coming out with a distribution on its own, which is better than Magento open source. The only way to prove that to a huge giant like Adobe is actually to do it.
Yeah.
And of course, the pity would be that if currently the plug would be pulled because Adobe says, okay, you have your way, and here's the copyright of Magento, and take everything over. The pity would almost be that all of the effort in MageOS would be for nothing. But I think actually that's not true, because the effort is to create scripts to allow for the open source distribution of MageOS, the porting mechanism, different composer labels. A lot of that work could be thrown away if the conflict would be solved. But still, all of that work was basically putting together all of those people that were involved to practically work together towards something. And all of that effort would simply flow into, the thing that ideally would be called Magento open source. But so I think it's all for the good. It's only that we're still at a crossroads where we don't necessarily know, is this going to be a complete split, or is this going to be in the end working out in favor of all of the parties working together again. I
want to go back to that. I want to rewind to the part where we talked about the differences between the US and the enterprise culture in the US for Adobe Commerce and Magento in the past, and the way it is in Europe. I think one of the things that there has been an embracing of Magento is with the developer community in Europe, and it's much more robust compared to the US, where the interest was more in the agency space and thus the commercial space.
Yeah.
And my experience around organizing Magento events is that, especially in the United States, it's been difficult to get people to attend other than agencies who want to get an ROI out of the event. And I think that little bit is an underpinning of why the Magento community isn't as robust in the US and never has been compared to Europe.
Yeah, but it's a difficult one. So the meaning of open source on itself is a cultural thing. So in the Netherlands, the meaning of open source is, hey, it's open source. So if you put something for free and you contribute to it, then somehow you get better of it. And because you get better of it, well, that's the Dutch commerce mentality. Then you should do it because it's a commercial good thing. And that's already conflicting with the German attitude towards open source, which is much more, no, we do this for non-profit, and then there's profit, but there's a fine line in between, and you should never, ever cross that line. Which is, again, different from the French attitude, which I don't know because I don't understand it.
Yeah,
but that's already within Europe.
Yeah, they just let's have a glass of wine.
Exactly.
And we'll talk about it tonight.
The meaning of open source is let's have a glass of wine.
Yeah, and we'll talk about it later. And then tomorrow we'll talk about the meaning again, but let's make sure we prioritize our wine.
Yeah, and I have to admit that per region in the world, per country, this is different, and that's for a lot of different reasons. So, for instance, in India, I personally see that open source has much more meaning, that it's for free, and therefore you can simply benefit from it. While in Europe, it's a lot about contributing back, because otherwise it doesn't work. And then in the US, it's something that you need to fund, because otherwise it's not working. And in the end, I think that's totally okay. But it's explaining why in Europe a letter was written. And it was not necessarily in Europe, but it's that the largest portion of all of those signees was actually based in Europe. And then on top of it, MageOS is currently a foundation that is based in Poland. So it's explaining why it's based there, because the advocating that open source should remain open source is much stronger in Europe somehow. And I think that's just touching upon a lot of reasons, but also one of the things that is explaining why people in Europe have been watching the movement of Adobe with skepticism altogether. While in the US, it's maybe more like, hey, but if another large enterprise takes over an open source community, it's only for the good, because then more funding is available.
Yeah, exactly the opposite of this happened.
Yeah, but that's more the outcome, because if you look at it, Microsoft is a US based company as well, and they did it in the right way. So it's really depending upon who's doing what at this moment, what the outcome was. But it's at least explaining also why there's a difference between the US and Europe, which always brings up for me also a more difficult point, which is we also started to mention briefly Hyvä. And as I personally see it, and I think you're on that same page as well, is that if you're talking about the current revival of Magento, then it's not related to Adobe Commerce that much, but much more on MageOS, but also Hyvä, and theoretically a couple of other smaller involvements in there. Well, and already the fact that Hyvä is written with a couple of dots on the A is confusing.
Yeah.
That's a harder part. It makes it a more European thing. And the fact then also that, is that true? All of the employees at Hyvä currently are Europe-based as well. I think so.
Yes, that's true.
But yeah, so it makes it kind of like a European thing. And in the Netherlands, that's maybe nice to comment upon. I really get the feeling that almost all of the Dutch agencies that are doing Magento are currently shifting over towards Hyvä. So it's that important already. But I don't know about US. I personally believe that in the US, there's a larger portion in the US of Magento agencies that are actually going all the way towards PWA Studio and the headless approach.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Not sure.
I don't think so. I mean, maybe it would be completely custom. I think Hyvä is globally kind of the leader in what people are doing.
Yeah.
I think that, I'll be bold and I'll say that
you are bold.
Thank you. One thing that Hyvä has to do is come up with a community version of Hyvä. Maybe it's downsized or something, and it's free and you can run it, and it doesn't have all the features and everything that the full version has.
Yeah.
And then MageOS has that with everything decoupled, like Luma stripped out and Hyvä replaced, and then there's a paid version, or maybe MageOS has Hyvä as the free one, but you have to go through the rigmarole of decoupling Luma, and then the paid version of MageOS has Hyvä built in with it coming out of the box running without any extras.
Well, let's ask the Hyvä people if they're up for it. I'm in favor, but I still also think that regardless of what would be nice for the overall community, Hyvä is also thriving simply also because they have budget and they have money, and they're slowly competing actually with Adobe Commerce on multiple different levels. And because of that, they need the money. They need to have the funding to allow for that. And if Hyvä, its default theme would be free, then there needs to be a portion of the funding from a different angle or different area.
Yeah, it's a dichotomy, isn't it? There's a definite there's some tension in there, because the best thing for the community would be that there's a free version of Hyvä, but Hyvä can't exist without funding.
Yeah. Well, and the funny thing is, of course, everyone who's complaining about that Hyvä has a paid license is involved in Magento, and most likely somehow involved with the developing web shops where the merchant pays for that web shop with big money. So money talks anyway. And I think actually that fact is one way that I've always sold people that actually that license is not expensive at all. So the Hyvä license for the Hyvä themes is €1,000. So let's say $1,000. Then actually you could also say that you can get started with Luma as well. But one thing that you, of course, need to do then is make sure that the website is performant and etc. So things like page speed and core web vitals and etc. So that's where Hyvä out of the box is fast. But with Luma, you can still spend enough budget on tuning the performance. And that brings in all kinds of different techniques. Some of the techniques supported by Magento itself, some techniques through third-party vendors. But then in the end, I think actually the challenge here would be that tuning of Luma needs to be in a lower budget for less money than actually that $1,000 because otherwise you could just be better off with buying that license altogether. And at that moment, well, you can do the math, you can do the calculation, and then actually the Hyvä license is cheaper actually than Luma.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it in terms of buying a car, it's like buying a 10-year-old car and trying to make it go and have all the features of a brand new car. Yeah. Like, let's just say you want to get a Tesla, or you want to go with a Hyundai i20, and you want to make the both perform the same.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You're going to have to spend a lot of money on the Hyundai to make it go as fast as a Tesla.
Yeah, and the whole point is you can still make money with a web shop that is actually performing bad.
That's true.
But if you want to be in the top results, you need to invest from the beginning in the right technology. Well, and I think that's making up for the funding. But yeah, what I've always been triggered by is actually that Willem Wigman, a Dutch guy, a friend of mine, he came up with Hyvä. But actually in a time when everyone was complaining about Luma being bad, but already in the bare bones technology of Luma, you can see that Luma as a theme extends upon the blank theme, and the blank theme actually extends upon the core, but nothing is preventing you from just letting go of Luma, letting go of blank, replacing therefore all of the JavaScript and CSS with something else. It's just that everyone was waiting for Adobe to do that. And that reminds me of a conversation that I had in 2008 or 9 with Joaf Katner, where he introduced me the XML layer of the XML layout layer of Magento, and he explained, well, we've now built this current front end on top of it, but what we envision is that people just come up with their own CSS, JavaScript, and HTML and build something out of it as they wish. Well, and then 25 years later? No, 15 years later. It's only that Hyvä came up with that solution. So personally, I don't see Hyvä as necessarily the only way forward. It's more that we need initiatives like Hyvä and MageOS to prove that open source is not borrowing the source code of Adobe or Magento and just putting it to use and then complaining if it's not good enough. No, the real power of open source is that you just can take it, strip it, whatever you want, and then build something better on top of it. And that specific thing doesn't really require Hyvä to come up with a new license. It's basically somebody else who's saying, well, Tailwind CSS and Alpine JavaScript, I don't like them. I'm going to choose something else, Bootstrap 2 or so. And then on top of that, I'm going to build my own custom theme that is even faster. Yeah. So it's more that realization is important.
I want to ask a technical question. What would prevent the Hyvä team from creating a version of MageOS that is branched and that is everything is stripped away, all like you were just saying. The everything is blank is gone, Luma's gone, Hoof is the default, and for 2,000 euros you could buy this version and have that fork for you as the vendor. So out of the box, you're getting everything you need with some extra, without all that garbage that came from the original version. What's stopping them from doing something like that?
Time. Because I think actually on a practical level, what MageOS is now currently doing is they're looking at the source code of Magento as it's currently being maintained on GitHub. They reverse engineer how actually from that source code all of the packages come to being. And while actually producing then the packages as a mirror of Magento, so that's the direct copy of things. They also are translating everything into MageOS packages. And at that very moment, it's about stripping out pointless things that nobody needs. But that's just a few things because they don't want to be too opinionated to say, okay, we're going to remove, all of the GraphQL packages because we disagree with GraphQL. So they keep still a lot of things in there. But they are also adding already a couple of things on top of it. And that's making up for the logo that you have in the MageOS admin panel. So there's a fresh theme. That's making up for the ChatGPT integration that is already there or coming up. That's making up for the MageOS, the asynchronous handlers additions on top of the message queue. So it's already in there. It's just that the portion of new stuff that is added on top of it is not yet that much known. And it feels kind of like still experimental, like, hey, can we add a couple of packages on top of it and prove that MageOS has an added value?
Right.
If this is done a couple of times, then let's say MageOS is currently at version 1.0.1, if I'm still correct. Then if MageOS 1.4 comes out or so, then at that moment it could be a strategical decision to say, okay, let's drop Luma and blank, and let's drop a lot of other things if you don't want it. And from that moment onward, it becomes more interesting, to see how that could be driven into a new direction.
Yeah,
but I think still the stupid thing is Hyvä is a paid license. Luma is still the default theme. And we don't have a lot of other choices except for going headless. So even though there's already a lot of choices, it's still not the perfect amount of choices yet. But yeah, I personally see that as work in progress.
Yeah, I think the Breeze theme is the other one that's out there that has a little bit of popularity.
Yeah, for sure. And it's but it's partially based upon the same stack as Luma. So knockout require is still in there, but they've just made sure that the, let's say, the flaws why Luma is slow, they've tried to optimize those flaws in a lot of different ways. But I think also just under the paid license of Breeze. I'm not sure about their pricing and their licensing model, but it's again yet another example where it's at least the monolith of Magento being extended with a theme, which is not Luma to the very least. So that's a good thing. And it's also not headless, which is just something that people have nightmares of.
I think I think that the Breeze one has an open source version.
Oh, they do. Cool.
Yeah, I believe so. I'm not 100%. All right, I want to wrap up our talk today and talk a little bit about Shopware. You mentioned it earlier. I want to talk about the possibility of what would it look like to combine the two communities, Shopware and Magento, and what would be the problem if we did that? Yeah.
Well, I think in Europe, definitely Magento and Shopware are both pretty big. And if you look at it in Germany, where Shopware is actually based, then you can see that for some time Magento has been on the decline and Shopware on the rise. So there you can see a lot of developers and a lot of agencies that are actually doing both. And theoretically, if you say, well, the community is made up out of people and those people are doing both, then the community can do both as well. I think actually that's something that was done in Poland under the label Meet Commerce, and then there was another Meet Commerce in Spain and another one in Mexico. No, no.
I'm not sure.
Anyway, so Meet Commerce was a more general name instead of just saying Meet Magento. But what I personally see is still that developers are either really good at Magento or really good at Shopware, or sometimes a little bit of both. But because it's still two different technologies and extensions are a totally different game, and the architecture is different, it's not that easy that you could say, okay, let's merge the communities all together, or let's merge the communities together as well. It's more that Shopware definitely cleverly hooks into the story that Magento is on a decline because of all of the weird steps that Adobe is taking. But I think actually that now MageOS and Hyvä are there. A lot of Magento agencies in the Netherlands that crossed over to Shopware are actually crossing back again because they simply see, hey, but whatever was missing with Luma and etc. Is now back again with Hyvä as well. So yeah, I personally see that Magento and Shopware are more ecosystems, each one on their own, but it's never wrong to learn from one and another. But melting the communities together is I think nearly impossible. But I would also say that it's not really needed because well, at least the Magento community is again a little bit on the rise.
Yeah, I think maybe I'm thinking more for the US that there would be some benefit in terms of some synergy in trying to bring everybody together. But I think Mark Schust said it best that the Magento community in the US is the same 100 people over and over again. And the only time you see all 100, and you wouldn't even see that many, would be at a Meet Magento New York or Meet Magento Florida, where you just see the same people. And honestly, out of whatever our population is, 320 some million or 300 plus million people, 100 people is not that many people in the U.S. to do that.
No,
I think I was at Florida. It was mainly Europeans. It had to be at least half Europeans and at Meet Magento Florida.
And they all wanted to escape the bad weather in Europe.
Yeah, exactly. So the recreational activities around Meet Magento Florida are much more intriguing than the actual event itself. Ravi does a great job, by the way. It was such a great event, cool. and I would say that it is one that you can't miss. I think it's fantastic. He does such a great job, and Meet Magento's that Marcia does in New York, and Ravi's doing Florida. That is sort of like the hook that keeps people engaged. And I think we'll close it out on this. The frustrating part for me, what I hear because I haven't been to a Meet Magento event in Europe since before the pandemic, but what I hear from Adobe at these events is that Adobe's committed to the community. They have this slide where they put the Venn diagram up that says it's two communities, one, or two ecosystems, one. I don't know what they're saying. They're saying there's a split, whatever they're saying. But we hear this, right? But then we don't see anything after that. We don't see any engagement in the community. There's nobody out there speaking about anything. There's nothing that connects the community with Adobe Commercial like there was. And there should be. There should be one person in the entire company that bridges the gap between the community. And right now, my opinion is Adobe is 100% leaning on Magento Association to do that, and I think that's the wrong that's the wrong play. They have to have somebody inside, and we'll call it an evangelist. They should have a evangelist or an ambassador or somebody within Adobe, a community manager. All these terms, I'm just making them up right now. Like I know they didn't exist before today. They should have somebody that does that helps.
This was the joke, right?
This is they should have somebody within Adobe that is their job to help connect with the community. And honestly, that doesn't have to be just Adobe. It could be Experience Manager plus Adobe Commerce. It could help bridge this larger community.
Well, yeah, but personally, I think there's another step before that, and that is that Adobe needs to be more serious about trying to maintain that community as is, because otherwise it's not up to them, but it's more up to the community what happens to the future of both. And that sounds a little bit strange, but if that's I think also where we both are in agreement that if Adobe is not doing anything about the current situation, then the two of Magento open source / MageOS and Adobe on the other side, those two are going to be driven further and further apart. And then in the end, that slide about two communities coming together, that's really like a broken thing. So the only way to fix that is to listen to both sides. But I think actually on the Magento Association side and the MageOS side, there's at least people that are really trying their best to make sure that they're listening and open for any kind of opportunity that is there with Adobe itself. But at Adobe, there's also similar people, but those people are actually minor managers. And there's not a official position from Adobe to say, hey, but this person is really important because that's the connection between two worlds. That's kind of like what you say. There needs to be a single position that is important enough instead of just a couple of employees that are just also, by the way, talking to the community as well. It needs to be a strategy on its own to keep the open source project healthy.
Absolutely. Jisse, as I close out, I give everybody a chance to do a shameless plug about anything they want. This means you can plug your business or your kids' school or your favorite McDonald's in the Netherlands. What would you like to plug today?
Well, first of all, I think my plug was always almost at the beginning, where I just mentioned I was doing training and I have on-demand videos. So if people don't like Mark Schust, they can watch my videos instead. But the shameless plug is actually this one. I need to rise a little bit, and I don't know if it's in reverse or, but it's. Not Rage Against the Machine, but Mage Against the Regime.
That's good.
And it's falling nicely, Mage Against the Regime. It's nicely falling together with whatever we talked about, that I personally feel that MageOS is actually the little Mage Against the Regime, that we're trying to change the big giant of Adobe one way or another. And actually what I'm aiming for is to do a couple of videos that are going to be published on YouTube to promote the new brand of Maged Against the Regime.
And I love this idea. And by the way, I just love your creativity and how you come up with all these fantastic little tidbits.
Stupid little things.
You had some coasters before, Mage Talk. Or you had little coasters that were shit talk or something.
Oh yeah, talk beer shit.
Yeah,
and
shit.
that was actually I'm going to show you. So this is sorry for the light, but you can see there in the back a couple of posters, and those posters are originating from the Mage Test Fest conference. And the Mage Test Fest conference was, Magento, about testing, and it was a fest. And I think because of that fest, anything was basically allowed. So there was a lot of cursing. I'm not a person in favor of cursing, but there needed to be a little bit cursing, like project fuck-ups, and they're being fucked up without testing and stuff like that. So rough undertone, but it was fun to have that.
Right,
yeah.
Good. All right. Well, Jisse, it's great to speak to you today.
For sure. Thank you.
I think that we need to it would be interesting to do like a little panel with somebody from the Magento community here, maybe, and somebody in Europe and somebody in India even, to kind of get those perspectives, and maybe we have some pre-done questions, and I don't know. Let's think about that. You and I can be
and maybe even better to also really talk about how to move forward, like what kind of expectations people have in each region about what would be the best thing for Magento in the upcoming future.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it's been
cool.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a great evening.
And thank you so much.
Talk Commerce is a production of Content Basis, LLC. For more creative content, go to contentbasis.io.